Dondale is not a story about one bad officer, and it is not a story about one rough incident. It is a story about a system that spent years calling control rehabilitation. And that is the real point. When a teenager enters a closed juvenile facility, the state is basically telling society, we took him in, now we are responsible for him. But in reality, something very different can happen. A young person is not pulled out of chaos. He is simply moved into a different kind of chaos. Only now, there are metal doors, uniforms, reports, and clean official words like safety, discipline, and behavior management. And the most dangerous part is not one specific incident. The most dangerous part is the logic behind it. If a teenager shouts, he must be suppressed. If he resists, force must be used. If he is breaking down mentally, he must be isolated. If he becomes inconvenient, he must be removed from sight. That is how help slowly turns into punishment. And punishment starts being called procedure. It is a very convenient system, because the moment harsh treatment is called protocol, it stops looking like personal responsibility. Suddenly, nobody is really guilty. One person follows the instruction, another stands nearby, a third writes the report, a fourth signs it, and later someone says, we acted according to the rules. But the question is not whether rules existed. The question is who wrote those rules in the first place, and why everyone around decided this was normal. Dylan Voller became the symbol of this story, not because he was a perfect teenager. And this has to be said honestly. He was not a comfortable character for a clean, simple story. He had problems. He could act aggressively. He could lose control. He could break rules. He could threaten himself. He could provoke staff. But that is exactly why this story matters. Human rights are not tested on people everyone likes. A rehabilitation system is not tested on the calm, obedient, grateful ones. The real test begins when the system is facing someone difficult, someone damaged, angry, unstable, someone who does not know how to ask for help in a normal way, so instead he shouts, breaks things, and resists. And in that moment, you see what the system really is. Is it a system of support, or just a machine of suppression? Because if the only language a facility can speak to a troubled teenager is force, isolation, and restraint, then it is not correcting behavior. It is reinforcing it. It teaches one simple rule: the world works through pressure. Whoever is stronger is right. Whoever holds the keys decides how much dignity you are allowed to keep. And then society acts surprised when people come out angrier than before. But what were they taught? Trust? Self-control? Responsibility? No. They were taught that adults can call humiliation safety. That pain can be written down as procedure. That if nobody cares about you, almost anything can be done to you, as long as it happens behind closed doors. The Dondale story is disturbing not only because harsh methods were used. It is disturbing because all of this existed inside an official system, not in a criminal basement. Not inside a gang, not in a place that was openly outside the law, but inside a facility operating in the name of the state. And that is a completely different level. Because when violence happens on the street, we at least understand where the criminal is. But when violence hides inside a system, it puts on a uniform, receives a job title, writes reports, and starts speaking the language of bureaucracy. Safety measures, behavior control, risk prevention, operational necessity. It sounds calm, almost sterile, but behind those words, there can be a young person who is not being healed, not being rehabilitated, not being heard. He is simply being pushed into silence. And that is the main illusion of closed institutions. From the outside, everything looks like order. The building is standing. The staff are working. The paperwork is complete. Management files reports. The problem cases are isolated. Society feels calm because the problem has been removed from view. But silence behind a wall does not always mean safety. Sometimes it only means a person has been forced to stop making noise. Four Corners did not simply expose shocking footage. They exposed a mechanism where a troubled teenager is first turned into a threat, then that threat is suppressed, and then the suppression is described as normal work. And if a viewer asks, so what were they supposed to do? Just let them do whatever they wanted? No, of course not. A closed facility needs rules. It needs safety. Staff members also have the right to go home alive and unharmed. We should not pretend that troubled teenagers are harmless angels who were simply misunderstood. But there is a line between safety and humiliation. There is a line between control and cruelty. There is a huge difference between discipline and a system that creates more trauma. And Don Dale became a symbol of that line. Because the question is not whether dangerous behavior should be controlled. The question is why control became the only tool. Where were the specialists? Where was real rehabilitation? Where was trauma-informed care? Where was the system that should have understood one basic thing? This was not an adult offender with decades of criminal experience. This was a young person who had already entered the system damaged. Instead, what we see is an old and very convenient model. It is easier to lock up a difficult person than to understand him. Easier to suppress him than to rebuild him. Easier to label him a threat than to admit he may have once been someone left without protection. That is why this story hit Australia so hard, because it showed that the problem was not only inside the walls of Don Dale. The problem was the attitude. The way society looks at people it has already decided are lost. If someone from a stable family reaches a crisis point, people call him a teenager with problems. But if the same crisis happens to someone from a broken background, he is quickly called a threat. And once that label is placed on him, everything changes. People treat him harder, colder, with fewer questions. That is where the real injustice begins. Not in one strike, not in one restraint chair, not in one report, but in the fact that some people are written off before anyone even tries. It is the system says you are already damaged, so we do not have to be careful with you. And Don Dale is the story of where that logic leads. It does not make society safer. It simply creates people who leave the system with more anger, more distrust, and a deeper belief that a normal world was never meant for them. And then we build new facilities, hire new staff, write new reports, promise new reforms. But if the same idea remains underneath, break them instead of rebuilding them, then nothing really changes. Only the sign on the building changes. And that is the part people often miss. A scandal like Don Dale does not begin on the day the public finally sees it. It begins much earlier. It begins in small decisions. A report that is ignored. A complaint that goes nowhere. A staff member who says, "This is just how things are done here." A manager who decides not to ask too many questions. A government department that prefers clean paperwork over uncomfortable truth. And slowly, step by step, the unacceptable becomes normal. Not because everyone wakes up one day and decides to be cruel, but because a system can train ordinary people to stop noticing what they are becoming part of. That is one of the most frightening things about institutional abuse. It does not always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like routine. A shift starts, a door opens, a report is filed, a young person is moved from one unit to another, a restraint is used, a complaint is documented. Everyone goes home, and the next day the same thing happens again. That is how a culture is built. Not by one moment, but by repetition. And once a culture like that forms, it protects itself. Anyone who questions it becomes a problem. Anyone who speaks up is told they do not understand how difficult the job is. And to be fair, the job is difficult. Working inside a juvenile detention facility is not simple. Staff deal with aggression, trauma, self-harm risks, violence, mental health crises, and young people who often arrive with years of damage already behind them. But that is exactly why the system must be better than the chaos it is supposed to fix. If the answer to trauma is more trauma, then the facility has failed. If the answer to fear is intimidation, then the facility has failed. If the answer to instability is isolation and force, then the facility has failed. Because the goal should never be simply to make the room quiet. A quiet room can still contain a person who is falling apart. The goal should be to reduce harm, to build control, to teach responsibility, to show a young person that the world does not have to be ruled only by force. But Don Dale showed something very different. It showed what happens when the system becomes more focused on managing behavior than understanding it. And that difference matters. Managing behavior means stopping the visible problem. Understanding behavior means asking where that problem came from. Managing behavior asks, how do we make him stop? Understanding behavior asks, why is he reacting like this? Managing behavior can be quick. Understanding behavior takes time. It takes trained people. It takes patience. It takes money. And that is why many systems choose the shortcut. They choose control. Control is faster. Control looks good in reports. Control makes the building quieter. Control gives the appearance of order. But control without rehabilitation is not justice. It is storage. You are not rebuilding a person. You are simply keeping him somewhere until the sentence, the program, or the crisis is over. And then what? What happens when he leaves? Does he leave with more self-control, more trust, more ability to function in society? Or does he leave with one clear lesson burned into him? Nobody cared when I was powerless. That lesson is dangerous, not only for him, for everyone. Because a justice system that creates more damage does not protect society in the long run. It only delays the problem. It pushes it into the future. And when that person returns to the outside world, carrying more anger, more fear, and more distrust, society acts shocked. But the truth is simple. People often come out carrying exactly what the system gave them. If the system gave humiliation, they carry humiliation. If it gave violence, they carry violence. If it gave isolation, they carry isolation. If it gave nothing but control, then do not be surprised when control is the only language they understand. That is why the Don Dale scandal matters beyond Australia, because every country has places like this in some form. Different names, different uniforms, different buildings, different official language, but the same risk. A group of people gets labeled as difficult, dangerous, lost, or beyond help. Then the public stops paying attention. Then the institution gets more power and less scrutiny. And once nobody is watching, the line begins to move. What was once unacceptable becomes necessary. What was once shocking becomes routine. What was once hidden becomes part of the job. And then one day footage comes out, or a whistleblower speaks, or an investigation opens, and everyone says the same thing. How could this happen? But the better question is, how many people had to look away for it to continue? Because systems do not become abusive in silence by accident. They become abusive because silence protects them. Silence from staff who are afraid to speak. Silence from managers who do not want scandal. Silence from officials who do not want political damage. Silence from the public because the people inside are easy to ignore. And that is why closed institutions need constant scrutiny. Not because every staff member is bad, not because every facility is evil, but because power without visibility always creates risk. Especially when the people inside are young, poor, traumatized, or already seen as trouble. Those are the people easiest to dismiss, the easiest to blame. The easiest to say, well, they must have done something. And once society accepts that logic, almost anything can be justified. Restraint becomes safety. Isolation becomes management. Humiliation becomes discipline. Failure becomes reform. And the person at the center of it all disappears behind a label. Not a name, not a life, not a past, just a label. High risk, non-compliant, difficult, aggressive, unmanageable. Those words may be useful in a report, but they can also become a way to erase someone's humanity. Because once a person is described only as a risk, people stop asking what happened to him. They only ask how to contain him. And containment is not the same as rehabilitation. That is the core issue. A juvenile system should not exist simply to hide young offenders from society. It should exist to change the direction of their lives. That does not mean pretending their actions do not matter. Accountability matters. Victims matter. Public safety matters. But accountability without rehabilitation is just a cycle. A young person does something wrong. The system punishes him. He becomes worse. He comes back. The system punishes him again. And everyone calls it justice, even though nothing is being repaired. Real justice should ask a harder question. How do we stop this person from becoming more dangerous? How do we interrupt the pattern? How do we protect society not just today, but 5 years from now? Because if the answer is only punishment, then the system is not solving the problem. It is feeding it. Don Dale forced people to confront that uncomfortable truth. The question was no longer just, what did these young people do? The question became, what did the system do to them after it took control of their lives? That question matters. Because when the state takes away someone's freedom, it also takes on responsibility. It controls the doors, the food, the movement, the schedule, the medical care, the discipline, the environment, everything. So when something happens inside, the state cannot simply shrug and say he was difficult. Of course he was difficult. That is why he was there. The entire purpose of the institution was supposed to be dealing with difficulty in a way that did not create more damage. And if the only solution was force, then maybe the facility was never equipped to do the job it claimed to do. Maybe it was never truly built for rehabilitation. Maybe it was built for containment and dressed up with softer words. And that is a pattern we see again and again. The public hears the word rehabilitation and imagines programs, structure, therapy, education, discipline with purpose. But inside some places, rehabilitation can become just a label, a word placed on top of a system that mostly isolates, restrains, and manages. And when the label sounds good enough, people stop asking what is actually happening. That is why language is so powerful. Call something a behavior management unit, and it sounds professional. Call someone non-compliant, and it sounds like the problem is entirely his fault. Call restraint a safety measure, and people imagine order. Call isolation separation, and it sounds less severe. But changing the word does not change the reality. A locked room is still a locked room. A person in crisis is still a person in crisis. A system that uses force as its main answer is still a system without enough real answers. And after the Four Corners investigation, the country could no longer hide behind language. The images were too strong. The public reaction was too intense. The government had to respond. There were inquiries. There were promises. There were discussions about reform. But the deeper question remained. Was Don Dale an exception? Or was it simply the place where the cameras finally showed what had been ignored for years? Because scandals often work like that. People want to believe the exposed facility is the bad one, the rotten apple, the unusual case, the place where things went wrong. That belief is comforting. It lets everyone else feel clean. But the harder possibility is that Don Dale was not a strange anomaly. It may have been a warning sign. A sign of what can happen anywhere when young people with trauma are placed in institutions built more for control than healing. And that is why this story should not be watched only with shock. Shock fades. Outrage fades. A headline lasts a few days. A viral clip lasts a week. Then the public moves on. But the people who lived through it do not move on that quickly. For them, this is not a news cycle. It is memory. It is the way their body reacts when a door slams, the way they feel when someone in uniform approaches, the way they learn to expect betrayal before help, the way they carry distrust into adulthood. And that is another part society rarely wants to talk about. Institutional damage does not stay inside the institution. It follows people out, into relationships, into work, into the streets, into future conflicts, into the next generation. A system that fails one young person can create consequences that last for decades. And then people ask why the cycle continues, why the same communities keep appearing in the same statistics, why the same families keep being pulled into the same institutions, why punishment does not seem to fix anything. Maybe because punishment was never enough. Maybe because some systems were designed to react to damage, not repair it. Maybe because it is easier to build stronger doors than stronger support. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Don Dale. It becomes a question about what society believes certain people deserve. Do we believe a troubled teenager deserves a future? Not in theory, not in a slogan, but in practice. When he is angry, when he is difficult, when he has done wrong, when he is hard to like, when helping him is expensive, slow, frustrating, and politically unpopular, that is the real test. Because almost everyone supports rehabilitation as an idea. It sounds good, it sounds civilized. But real rehabilitation is not clean. It is not quick. It is not always emotionally satisfying. It means working with people who may reject help at first. It means dealing with setbacks. It means training staff properly. It means mental health care, education, structure, accountability, human dignity. And it means accepting that if the system wants better outcomes, it cannot rely on methods that produce worse people. That is the contradiction at the heart of Don Dale. A facility meant to correct behavior became accused of teaching the very lessons society should want to erase: fear, distrust, force, silence, survival. And once those lessons are learned deeply enough, they do not disappear when the gate opens. They travel with the person. So when we talk about Don Dale, we are not just talking about what happened inside one institution. We are talking about what kind of society gets built when certain people are considered disposable. Because that is the darkest part. A system does not have to say out loud, "These people do not matter." It can show it through budgets, through staffing, through ignored warnings, through weak oversight, through reports that collect dust, through facilities that stay open long after everyone knows they are failing. Neglect is also a message, and the message is clear. You are not important enough for us to fix this properly. That message can destroy a person, especially someone who already entered the system believing nobody cared. And that is why Don Dale became more than a scandal. It became a mirror held up to a society that wanted to believe it was protecting the vulnerable, while some of the most vulnerable people were being managed like threats behind closed doors. And maybe that is why the story is so uncomfortable. Because it removes the easy distance. It forces people to admit that harm does not always come from monsters. Sometimes it comes from systems, from policies, from routines, from people who think they are just doing their job, from leaders who act only when the public finally sees what was hidden. And if there is one lesson in this case, it is this: the true measure of a justice system is not how loudly it talks about order. It is how it treats the people who have the least power inside it. Because anyone can control someone with force. That is easy. The harder thing is to change someone without destroying what is left of them. And if a system cannot do that, then it should stop calling itself rehabilitation. It should call itself what it really is: a place that hides failure behind locked doors.